29,000 people went to sleep that night expecting to open their shops in the morning, walk their kids to school, and head out to the cotton fields. Roughly 7,000 made it to dawn. They had almost 12 hours to get out, from the moment ash started falling from the sky to the moment the mud rolled into town. For all 12 hours, scientists tried to get through to the authorities. Phone lines went unanswered, and a voice over the loudspeakers by the church kept repeating one word: stay calm. This is the story of a town that ceased to exist in a single night. The mountain, for its part, behaved predictably. It had been sending signals for months, and they were recorded, mapped, and discussed in offices. Everything that happened on November 13th, 85 had been described in advance, in a document that sat on desks a full month before the disaster. Let's go back there to the final hours of a town that no longer exists. Official records shot before November 85 paint the Colombian town of Armero as almost model perfect, a thriving farming province in the department of Tolima. In the grainy film footage from those years, wide streets, whitewashed facades that earned the town its nickname, the White City, and cotton fields stretching to the horizon. In the archives, Armero remains alive and confident in its tomorrow. Just hours before the end, those streets breathed something very different. Thick, heavy air, gray rain of fine particles settling on the rooftops, and that particular kind of well-being that can't recognize its own bad news. When the sun slipped behind the Cordillera Ridge on November 13th, the people of Armero weren't bracing for disaster. They were closing out an ordinary workday. Shopkeepers were stashing goods in the back rooms. Kids were spilling out of schools and scattering across Boulevard Square. Families were sitting down to dinner in front of flickering TV screens. The town stood on the wide valley floor where, by the laws of simple physics, everything that breaks loose from the summit flows down, and that fact was the last thing on anyone's mind that evening. To grasp the scale, you have to strip the melodrama from the story and look at the geography. The town was fed by black, rich, impossibly fertile soil built up over centuries of volcanic deposits, the very same ones that would one day sign its death warrant. Nevado del Ruiz stood 48 kilometers away, high in the ridge, looking like a harmless frozen giant, just part of the scenery. It had been silent for nearly 140 years. The last truly destructive eruption was back in 1845 when mudflows swept through this same valley and killed around 1,000 people. Several generations had come and gone since, and the memory had faded into a footnote of local history. To the people of 85, the mountain was just a mountain. That forgetting took a particularly unlucky shape. The very fertile plain Armero stood on was, quite literally, built from the material of past lahars. The mud flows of 1595 and 1845 had poured out of the same gorge, spread across the same valley floor, and once hardened, left a flat stretch of excellent soil. The town was built on the deposits of a previous catastrophe, and a century and a half later, the new flow ran along them like a pre-dug channel. The geologists mapping the area in 85 weren't guessing. They simply looked at where the mud had already gone twice. Armero was a flat, horizontal town of single-story houses under tile roofs with wide inner courtyards designed to escape the tropical heat. Commerce revolved around cotton and rice money and drew workers from all over the region. The population had passed 29,000. There wasn't a single evacuation plan. The streets leading to higher ground were narrow, squeezed between buildings in the channel of the Lagunilla River, and the very shape of the terrain turned the town into a geometric funnel. And yet the warnings were there, and that's the whole point. The mountain started showing signs of life in late 1984. First came the seismics, a series of small tremors beneath the summit, picked up by instruments and known to a handful of specialists. Then came the fumaroles, the smell of sulfur in the highlands, warm water in the rivers running off the glacier. By the spring of 85, it was clear the volcano was entering an active phase, and geologists began making trips up the slope. On September 11th, there was a notable eruption. The mountain threw out ash that settled over Manizales, a city 70 kilometers to the west. After that, doubt was no longer an option. Colombian specialists and visiting experts, including an Italian team, were all working on Nevado del Ruiz, and they were all writing roughly the same thing. The mountain itself wasn't especially dangerous. The eruption expected was modest. The danger was the ice. A glacial cap sat on the summit, and any hot material hitting it would, within minutes, release millions of cubic meters of meltwater rushing down the river channels. Not as water, but as a lahar, a mudflow of rock and debris. In the fall of '85, a volcanic hazard map was produced. The work took a few weeks and was finished in early October, a little over a month before the eruption. The map showed where the flows would go if the mountain woke up. Armero was shaded in as a zone of highest risk. Practically the entire built-up area was in the line of fire. In hindsight, that map has often been called one of the most accurate forecasts in the history of volcanology because exactly what it showed happened and exactly where it showed it. The map was copied and circulated. It was seen at the departmental level, written about in the press, discussed at meetings. And then comes the part you want to blame on someone's malice, except it doesn't break down that way. Evacuating 29,000 people in the middle of harvest season cost money the department didn't have and meant shutting down the economy of an entire region. Neither the geologists nor the local emergency committee had the authority to order it. A decision of that scale gets made higher up. The forecast was probabilistic. The mountain could wake up tomorrow, or it could keep venting steam for another 10 years. And the person signing the order risked going down in history as the one who bankrupted a province over a puff of ash. The scientists' warnings had been dismissed time and again as alarmism and exaggeration. And on November 6th and 7th, a week before the eruption, the Palace of Justice was stormed in Bogotá, and all the attention of the country, the press, and the government went there. The map wasn't rejected. It was set aside, and everyone who set it aside did so for a reason that looked perfectly reasonable on their own desk. The morning of Wednesday, November 13th, began in Armero with the usual thick, clinging heat. Shops on Bolivar Square opened by 7, unfurling canvas awnings against a sun that would push past 30 degrees by noon. Trucks loaded with bales of fresh cotton rolled down the main streets, kicking up dust that mixed with the smell of coffee from the cafes. Agricultural cooperatives were posting record earnings, and day laborers packed the shops for tools and weekend supplies. The town ran on the momentum of work and long-term plans. The architecture of the White City only reinforced the feeling of permanence. Colonial and Republican buildings with thick walls of rammed earth, whitewashed so carefully they dazzled the eyes. High ceilings on heavy beams of local timber, roofs of fired clay tile that had weathered decades of tropical downpours. Life unfolded on verandas and in leafy inner courtyards. On street corners, transistor radios picked up local stations. Between songs came news from Bogotá about the storming of the Palace of Justice a week earlier. Against that backdrop, the fact that the water in the Lagunilla River ran warmer than usual didn't even rate a mention. By 2 in the afternoon, the oddities started coming one after another, and each one on its own could be chalked up to the weather. In pool halls and bank offices, clerks noticed the tap water running cloudy, with a sulfur smell and dark sediment. Housewives filling jugs for dinner set them aside and waited for the murk to settle. Nobody shut off the water supply, and nobody asked why the river smelled like matchsticks. On the outskirts, livestock and stray dogs were frantic, pulling away from the lowlands, seeking higher ground. Cows refused to enter their stalls by the water's edge. Birds lifted off the trees in flocks and headed for the hills. Old-timers who'd lived in the valley their whole lives would later recall that the animals behaved like never before. That day, almost no one paid it any mind. The administrative machine ran as if nothing were wrong. City Hall kept its offices open. The hospital was on its usual schedule. Births, blood pressure, a hand cut in the fields. The church was preparing evening mass, and the bell ringer climbed up to the bell. Teachers assigned homework for tomorrow, because tomorrow still existed. After 3 in the afternoon, the sky over Armero began to change. Sunlight was cut off by a dense mass of dark clouds, and they weren't coming from the ocean, they were coming from the mountain peak. Within minutes, something fine, light, and pale gray began to fall on the streets, the cars, and the heads of passers-by. It was volcanic ash, At first, people almost took it as a joke. Kids held out their palms and laughed, showing each other their dirty fingers. Drivers switched on their wipers and grumbled about having to wash the car. Pedestrians opened umbrellas and shielded themselves with newspapers. People cracked jokes about snow in the tropics. No one connected the gray powder on their hands with what it actually was. Pulverized rock blasted from the throat of Nevado del Ruiz, and its presence meant exactly one thing: the mountain had woken up. The ash settled in an even layer on the white facades, on the roof tiles, on shoulders and hair. The streets the town prided itself on were covered in an hour with dust that crunched underfoot. Then the ash grew thicker and coarser, starting to sting the eyes and scratch the throat, and the smell of rotten eggs, sulfur dioxide, became unbearable indoors. By 5 o'clock, it was clear this wasn't going to pass on its own. Mothers herded children in from the streets. Shops closed earlier than usual, hauling merchandise inside. Evening classes were canceled at the schools. Ash clogged the drains and lay on the roof tiles in a layer that would turn heavy in any rain. Those who understood that climbed onto their roofs to sweep it off with brooms. People did exactly what you do during an ash fall, and they did it right. No one connected what was happening to the glacier 48 kilometers away, because the only person who could make that connection was someone who'd read the map, and no one in Armero had read the map. The authorities' response was paralysis. The parish priest, over the church loudspeakers, asked the townspeople to stay calm and assured them the phenomenon was temporary. Local radio stations read official bulletins: "Stay in your homes, close the windows, cover your face with a damp cloth." Formally, that was sensible during an ash fall. That's exactly what you should do to avoid breathing in the dust and causing a stampede on the roads. And it was precisely that order that locked thousands of people at the bottom of the valley. According to the timeline reconstructed later, around 7 in the evening, the local Red Cross chapter did finally order people to evacuate. Then the ashfall stopped, the mountain went quiet, and the order was rescinded. The alarm seemed false, and no one wanted to rouse the town in the middle of the night over a dust shower that had fizzled out. By 7 in the evening, the ash gave way to a downpour. Heavy, cold drops came mixed with hail and mud washing down the mountain. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, and it became physically impossible to see the volcano or check the river levels. Streetlights flickered from the lightning, plunging whole blocks into intermittent half-darkness. The few who tried to reach emergency services in the departmental capital got dead lines or evasive answers that downplayed reports of rivers already overflowing their banks upstream. No one in town knew that, farther up the Lagunilla, the natural barriers had already given way. By 8:30, the main streets had turned into channels of liquid mud, and nothing was visible outside. Families gathered deep inside their homes, bolted the wooden gates and slid iron bars across the windows. In hundreds of living rooms, tube televisions flickered with distorted images of the evening news. In kitchens, dinners were being cooked late on gas stoves, their hissing barely audible above the roar of water pounding the rooftops. The routine of that evening is pieced together from the accounts of the few who went outside. People washed dishes. They herded dogs under shelter. They swept up ash tracked in from the street on their shoes, cursing that they'd never get rid of the dust. Now, they checked whether the roof was leaking under a downpour of that intensity. They moved goods in their shops to higher shelves in case the water from the street reached the doorstep water, not anything else. Someone was finishing homework due the next day. Someone else was watching the news from the capital, where they were still trying to figure out what had happened at the Palace of Justice. All of it, perfectly normal behavior for people whose weather had turned bad. The instinct of these people was flawless in every way except for one circumstance they didn't know about. In a thunderstorm and downpour, the smartest thing is to wait it out at home, behind thick walls, away from the street. For centuries, their ancestors had survived exactly that way. Everyone who listened that evening and stayed inside did precisely what common sense, the voice of authority, and the voice of the church all told them to do. There were doubters. Some neighbors pounded on doors, urging people to head for the hills. Others couldn't shake the smell of sulfur and the growing rumble from the mountains. Each time, the answer was the same. The authorities said to stay put. The priest said it was temporary. The radio said don't panic. The doubters went back inside and closed the door behind them. Around 9 in the evening, Nevado del Ruiz truly erupted. A searing blast shot from the crater and slammed into the ice cap, snows that had been piling up on the summit for millennia. The eruption itself was modest. The mountain gave up only a fraction of what it was capable of. It was enough. The heat instantly melted a massive volume of ice. Millions of cubic meters of water formed in a matter of minutes, and the water, mixed with ash, rock, and debris, surged down the narrow mountain ravines that led straight to the valleys and towns below. Between what happened at the summit and what happened in the town lay more than 2 hours. This is the most crucial fact of the entire night. The mountain erupted around 9 in the evening. The lahar hit Armero around 11. Between those 2 moments, over 100 minutes, enough time for a grown person to walk to the hills on the outskirts, enough time for a car to carry a family to safety and come back for the neighbors. The eruption was recorded by instruments. The monitoring stations knew about it. The distance from the summit to the town was 48 kilometers, and the flow was moving along channels marked on a map drawn up a month earlier. None of that became a message that reached the people of Armero. Phone service in the department had been spotty all evening. Radio stations kept broadcasting bulletins prepared before the eruption, and the thunderstorm, the downpour, and the downed power grid cut the town off from everything else. The rumble from the mountains was audible, but a rumble from the mountains during a tropical storm is always audible. In the ravines, the mass funneled together, picked up speed, and swallowed new debris. The Lagunilla River ceased to exist as a river. It became entirely lahar. Roughly 80% of that mass was solid, pulverized material. Granite boulders the size of trucks, riverbed sediment, vegetation ripped out by the roots, and only 20% was water, superheated by the volcano's depths. The flow tore through the narrow channel at 50 to 70 kilometers per hour, dragging stones the size of cars and whole trees along with it. When it reached the open plain where the town stood, it met nothing that could stop it. Armero wasn't the only destination. The glacier sat on the summit on all sides, and the water ran down several channels at once. On the western slope, the lahar reached the town of Chinchina in the department of Caldas and killed around 1,800 people there by itself, one of the largest volcanic disasters of the century, and almost no one remembers it, because 70 kilometers to the east that same night, something else happened. The echo of movement inside the homes of the White City was muffled by thick walls and the roar of the local thunderstorm. The power had been flickering for hours, and around 11, the grid finally collapsed. High-voltage lines shorted out one after another. Transformers exploded, flooding the sky with bluish flashes, and the town plunged into total darkness. And then, in the Tolima Valley, a sound rose that had never been heard there before. Survivors on the lower slopes would later describe it the same way. Not an explosion, but a roar. Low, continuous, mechanical, the kind that made the ground tremble, like an endless freight train grinding everything beneath it. People threw themselves out of bed into the darkness, torn open by lightning flashes through the ash-choked sky, and rushed to throw open gates and the iron grills on their facades. There was no room to maneuver anymore. The first wave, a flow of liquid mud with plant debris and field trash, flooded the streets and courtyards, rose to the knees, and jammed doors shut with the weight of the sediment. The air inside and out turned hot, dense, sticky with suffocating vapor, heavy with sulfur dioxide that burned the lungs. 20 minutes to midnight. No organization, no evacuation plan, no community sirens. Phones, street and home, dead and hail, mixed with ash falling from above. People ran blind toward the high ground on the outskirts, toward the hill with the cemetery, toward the knoll with the cross. The lahar hit Armero from the north. It didn't spread like a flood, slowly rising. It struck like a battering ram. The difference here is fundamental, and it explains why almost no one in the city managed to save themselves. With a flood, people have time. The water rises inch by inch. You can climb higher, you can get away. A lahar with 80% solid material doesn't behave like a liquid. It behaves like a moving mass of concrete. It doesn't flow around an obstacle, it plows straight through it. The density of such a mixture is roughly twice that of water, and the pressure against a house wall at speeds approaching 60 kilometers per hour is too much for clay, brick, or the concrete of low-rise buildings to withstand. The houses on the northern edge started collapsing immediately, as if the walls had lost all their weight. What had stood for decades crumbled in a fraction of a second. There were several surges. They came in waves, with gaps between them, and each one buried what was left of the one before. Many tried to escape by climbing onto rooftops and second floors, where by any logic it should have been safer. The lahar was higher than the roofs. Others ran in the darkness, slipping and falling in the mud, dragging children along, going back for family members and never coming out again. The flow moved faster than any person can run. Outrunning it was as realistic as outrunning a train. Foundations were washed out in seconds. Houses were ripped from their bases and carried off in the churning mess of water, rocks, and debris, sometimes with people still inside. The current dragged some for miles and, losing strength on the flatlands, let them go alive, battered, caked in mud, still breathing. Most were not so lucky. The mud surged in wave after wave, thicker and heavier, and swallowed entire neighborhoods in under 5 minutes. Where streets, homes, and a town square had stood just a second earlier, there was now one solid moving mass. Cries from the darkness, drowned beneath the roar and the weight of thousands of tons of sediment sliding off the ridge. By midnight, most of the city no longer existed, and most of its residents never had time to understand what was happening. When the gray, blurred light of Thursday, November 14th, broke through the veil of warm fog and hanging dust, the few survivors, those who had managed to climb high into the trees or onto the cemetery stones, saw that the city was unrecognizable. The entire valley had become a desert of gray mud, thick, viscous, steaming, stretching unbroken to the horizon and covering more than 30 square kilometers. Where Armero had stood, there was now a crust of sediment, 6 to 8 meters of compacted material in the lowest spots. The silence that settled over the valley at sunrise was heavy. No rumble of trucks, no chatter in Bolivar Square, no school bell, no birds, no dogs in the yards. Only one sound remained: the constant hiss of gases escaping from the hot mud as it dried under the morning sun. And if you listened closely, the fading voices of those still alive beneath the crust. The landmarks breaking the flat surface looked ghostly. The crowns of mango trees and century-old ceiba trees stood stripped of leaves and branches, their twisted trunks showing above the crust of cemented ash. Here and there, in what used to be the residential area, the top corners of 2-story concrete buildings poked a few centimeters above the surface. That was how you could tell how deep the city had sunk. Above the plain rose the top of the main church's bell tower, a whitewashed tower without its bell, standing in the middle of a desert of sediment. Beneath the crust, people were still alive. Men and women stuck up to their chests and necks in the sediment, pinned by the rubble of their own homes. Voices rose from under the gray surface, someone calling their children's names, someone praying, someone asking for water. Entire families, buried together, called out to one another while they still had the strength. By the evening of the 14th, rescuers, journalists, and volunteers from all over Colombia and from abroad began fighting their way to what was left of Armero. They went on foot because there were no roads left. Helicopters landed on the rare patches of solid ground. Survivors were everywhere, and almost none of them could be reached. The sediment held bodies in a death grip, like cement that hadn't set. Any effort threatened to collapse the debris and push a person deeper. Rescuers waded in up to their waists and got stuck themselves. There was no heavy machinery, no pumps, no organized operation in those first hours. There were bare hands, ropes, and boards. People worked until they dropped, pulled one person out, and heard another calling from a few meters away, someone they couldn't get to in time and had to choose who to go to. There was nothing to work with and nowhere to work. Heavy equipment couldn't reach the city. The sediment itself had blocked the roads. The bridges over the Lagunilla were gone, and the surface that looked solid from a distance gave way under a person's weight. Helicopters evacuated the wounded from rare clearings, But there weren't enough of them, and the wait to be lifted out stretched for hours. Medical care was being set up in neighboring towns, but the injured still had to be transported there. In the first 24 hours, the decision of who to pull out wasn't based on how critical their condition was. It was based on who could be reached by hand. One name the world remembers. Omaira Sanchez Garcon, 13 years old, pinned by the rubble of her own home, stood in water and mud up to her neck. Underwater, her legs were trapped beneath what used to be the walls, and beside her, as rescuers later realized, she was held by the arms of her dead aunt. The only ways to free her were to dismantle everything underwater or amputate her legs. Neither was possible with what they had. Just to pump out the water, slowly rising around her. They needed a pump. No pump was brought. They tried pulling her out, but every attempt caused her such pain and threatened to tear her body apart that they gave up on it. All that was left was to stay by her side. For about 60 hours, nearly 3 days, Omaira held on. She talked to those around her. She asked them to send greetings to her mother, who was away and whose fate the girl didn't know. She sang. She prayed. She talked about the math lessons she'd miss and how she'd have to catch up. Sometimes she cried from fear and cold. Sometimes she held herself together with a calm that the adults beside her found harder to manage than she did. It was shot by French photographer Frank Fournier. The photograph, darkened, almost black eyes from days of struggle above gray water, circled the globe and won World Press Photo of the Year in '86. The image became the face of the disaster and, at the same time, an indictment, because it shows rescue was possible. What was missing was a pump. On November 16th, on the third day, her heart stopped. She said goodbye to those around her and slipped beneath the water. Behind Omaira stood thousands of others like her, trapped, calling out beyond reach. Of the more than 20,000 dead, many didn't die the first night under the force of the lahar, but later, waiting for help that came too late or never came at all. Rescue efforts went on for weeks, and the toll wasn't just counted in the dead. The wounded and those pulled from the mud numbered in the thousands, and they were taken to hospitals in neighboring towns that were never built for such a flood of patients or such injuries. Hypothermia, chemical burns from sulfur-saturated mud, crushed limbs, infections in wounds packed with volcanic debris. Aid poured in from around the world, but the first decisive hours passed without it. The town was erased, not just physically. Of 29,000 residents, about 7,000 survived. People left with no home, no job, and in many cases, not a single relative. They were resettled in surrounding communities, and for some of the survivors, a new town was built nearby. Children left without parents and without documents became a separate, long, and painful story. Sorting out who belonged to whom took years, and not all were ever found. The site itself was sealed off. Armero was not rebuilt on its original location because of the same map that had sat untouched for a month. The plain remained what it was, and the next flow would go the same way. In '86, John Paul II visited the ruins and prayed on the mud field above the buried town. There were 2 state-level consequences, and both came late. In '86, a volcanological observatory opened in Manizales, the country's first, tasked with permanent monitoring of Nevado del Ruiz. And a few years later, Colombia established a national emergency warning and response system, a unified structure with the authority that, in November of '85, no one had possessed. Both decisions were made by the same institutions that, a month before the disaster, had been holding that map. Reconstructing Armero's final hours leaves no room for the story of unpredictability. The town didn't die from a sudden strike of an alien force of nature, but from the coincidence of a moderate eruption with a chain of decisions, each one made by people who considered themselves responsible. The mountain had been signaling for nearly a year, and the signals were recorded. Scientists described the scenario with a precision that in hindsight looks chilling and plotted it on a map a month before the event. The map was read and set aside. It demanded money that didn't exist and authority that didn't exist either, for an event that might never happen. On the evening of the 13th, ash fell for hours, and the order to close windows and stay indoors was the right order for ash. The Red Cross ordered an evacuation. The ashfall stopped, and the order was canceled. Phone lines in the department were down, and the whole country that week was watching Bogotá, where the Palace of Justice had been stormed a week earlier. Not one foolish step, not one obvious villain, and more than 20,000 dead. The mechanism that worked here is made of things that, each on its own, looks like a trifle, a probabilistic forecast no one wants to back with money. Authorities smeared across agencies so thin that no one actually decides. A correct instruction issued for the wrong threat. A canceled alarm because the first time nothing happened. Information noise clogging the channel in the week the channel was needed. And a shared, unspoken conviction seated in no one in particular that a known danger is thereby already accounted for. Today, where Armero stood, there is a quiet field. The town was never rebuilt. Crosses, headstones, and name plaques stand here. A surviving bell tower and a few fragments of walls still jut from the earth where that night caught them. The site was turned into a memorial, an open-air mass grave where people come to remember, and where, decades later, names are still being found. 29,000 people started that day like any other. Nearly 3/4 of them never saw the dawn. They were told to close their windows, cover their faces with a damp cloth, and wait until morning, and it was sensible advice given by people who had a map on their table.